We've just seen the film Milked, and now we're ready to start a discussion on the problems raised in the film and also about the similarities with the situation in Sweden and the EU, and of course, most importantly, about possible solutions to these problems. And on screen, we have Chris Hurway, the guy you saw in the film and the producer behind the film.
Kia ora. Kia ora everyone, hello.
We also have in the room Annika Karlsson-Kanyama. You're a climate scientist and you worked at the Swedish Armed Forces Research Institute for many years and also been a part of the special governmental council on sustainability. We also have David Stenholtz. You're chief physician in oncology. You're specializing in cancer treatments. You've also started and shared the organization Läkare för framtiden, or Physicians for Future. And you work with trying to get people to eat healthier as a preventive health measure. Further, we have Camilla Bergvall, and you're the national chair of Djurens Rätt, Animal Rights Sweden, the largest and oldest animal rights and animal welfare organization in Sweden. And last but not least, we have Jens Holm. You're a member of the Swedish Parliament and you share the traffic committee in the Parliament, and you're also the climate policy spokesperson for Vänsterpartiet, the Swedish Left Party. Previously you've also been in the European Parliament, and I know that you have been shining a light on these problems for a long time. It's not me, but I hand over to my colleague Anne.
Thank you. And first of all, Chris, I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight for us, in the morning for you, I know. We really appreciate it very, very much. And thank you also for this very, very important film. I know it was launched in the middle of March, but how has it been received so far in New Zealand and also globally?
Yes, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the other panelists who have come and everyone supporting the event. I really hope everyone's enjoyed the film. Look, you know, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're still, of course, like many, coming off the back of COVID-19. The dairy industry really is the backbone of the economy here. And so, unfortunate for the film, the dairy industry is really seen as a kind of hero character here in this country. Economically, it's bringing us through the other end of this pandemic, and so we're still, of course, recovering and seeing the government having to make up for, economic commitments that it made before the pandemic. And so, here in Aotearoa, it has not really been received yet, the film. It's really sitting in the shadows. The government will not address it. To address the dairy industry here in this country would be to address, the very roots and foundations of our government and what makes this country tick. And so it's a very difficult conversation. Globally, we're seeing, of course, amazing support from supporters who are critiquing animal agriculture, but likewise, like other vegan or plant-based films or environmental films, I imagine it's going to be a bit of a slow burn, and hopefully it starts conversations in the right places and helps to build the case that we all have against animal agriculture, so that we can start making some progress. But yeah, it's unfortunately hasn't been the instant big splash that everyone would love it to have. But we've received a lot of great support and feedback from people, dairy farmers as well, especially here in Aotearoa. So I have hope for the longevity of the film moving into the future, but unfortunately, no fantastic, great big news in terms of impact just yet.
I understand. But hopefully, and eventually he will come there, we hope so. A question for the panel, and all of you. Why do you think it's so I mean, why is the link between animal agriculture and the problems we see concerning health and environment such a blind spot for so many? And also, why do you think the problems we see, the negative aspects we see in the dairy industry, why is it so silent? Would you like to start?
I would say because of profits, like the movie told. Yeah, it's about profits in the long term, but also and that influence culture and everything else for how we see food and what we see as food and so on. So yeah, that's the short answer.
Yeah.
Maybe someone like to build on that.
Yeah, and I think we often tend to equal animal products, equal food with animal products. So eating meat and drinking cow's milk, well, that is natural. Although that we know that it's extremely unnatural to consume so much animal products that we do today. And in order to do that, we need to industrialize the production. That is nothing natural at all about the milk production in New Zealand, but it's nothing natural at all about how we produce animal products here in Sweden. So I think this film is really important. We need more information. We need to, I think it was Paul McCartney that said, if the slaughterhouses had windows, nobody would eat meat. And so I think that's true. So we need more of this.
Well, I agree it could be profit, but also because animal food has throughout history been associated with richness, with masculinity, with being strong and so on. So we have been bred into thinking that it's good to eat animal products, you know. Since we were kids, there was free milk at school, for example, and it's subsidized by the government. So I think that's part of the answer. I think another part is that the farmers' organization in Sweden, though the farmers are a very small part of the population, they are very strong, they are very influential, you know, and yeah, I think politicians are afraid to tackle the emissions from the animal industry, not only in New Zealand but also here.
I think the psychological factors also is what you call cognitive dissonance, that most of us know that it's wrong to harm an animal, but I mean the largest professional organization of nutritionists and dietitians in the US, they have said for decades that a plant-based diet is nutritionally sufficient. And I always mention this in my lecture, that if you grasp the full concept of this, it should blow your mind, because what it actually says is that all this suffering we are exposing animals to are unnecessary. And I think this creates like a mental block for I mean anyone who eats animal products, and makes them resistant to all these facts. This, I think, and also peer pressure. 90% are still eating these products, and if you stop, you have to be a freak. No one wants to be that. Everyone wants to be like everyone else.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, do you have any comments on that?
I agree with what everyone has said. Dairy farming, animal agriculture, you know, they're one and the same. And at the root of animal agriculture, if we were to question it, we would be questioning a lot of the harmful ideologies that are wrapped in with the industry. And so it's not just addressing one single thing. If we were to address animal agriculture, dairy, we'd have to address our entire society, the foundation of society as we know it. So I believe, you know, whether we're talking about red meat or the dairy industry or the fishing industry, once we are able to have mature conversations around this industry as a whole, you know, it's going to change, the very foundations of society. So it's a very big beast that we have to tackle.
Annika, we saw in the film the devastating effects that animal agriculture has on the planet. Why is emissions from the animal agriculture still not included in our emission targets?
Well, I think it's the same reason. It's too sensitive subject, you know, and it's also difficult because the main emissions from animal agriculture is from bovines. They exhale methane, and that's very difficult to take away. There are some trials of supplementary in the fodder, for example, but you can't take it away. So the only way to get rid of it is to not have cows, for example, and that's a very sensitive issue. So I think a lot of people avoid it actually, because there is no technical fix to it. If there was a technical fix, you know, I don't know what, then I think it should be proposed, but there isn't any. So it's an unsolved problem. The only solution is not to have these cows and pigs and so on.
Jens, as a politician, do you agree, or what would you say there?
Yes, I do, and I think also it has to do with the fact that we usually talk about carbon dioxide, which is like the biggest greenhouse gas, obviously, but the impact, the climate impact from the animal industry stems very much from methane and nitrous dioxide, lost gas. And those are extremely potent greenhouse gases. But if you only count CO2, well, then you have a different output. Then it doesn't look so bad for the animal industry.
Jens, we saw in the film that it's very clear that it's not even financially beneficial, despite the subsidies. I mean, why is it still? I mean, we are talking about it. There is politicians are afraid to. I mean, it's a very sensitive area, of course, but still, it's very hard to understand why it's so hard to change the minds of people, because we can see that we will benefit from it even financially, actually.
Yeah, we would. Well, in Europe, as we all know, that we have the common European agriculture policy, and an awful lot of the money put into that, into the CAP, is subsidies to the animal industry, and that goes back to the reasoning of that the European Union want to be more or less self-sufficient on food, and as I said, food is equal to animal products, and so that's one of the reasons why we have the subsidies. When I saw this film, it also struck me that we have a certain factor of nationalism when it comes to food, and especially animal-based food, I think, because we could see in the film that the New Zealand milk, that is fantastic for environment, no problem at all. It's milk in other countries. Well, have you heard that before? How is it with the Swedish milk, the Swedish meat, etc.? So they have that kind of nationalism, I think, in all countries. So that is also something we need to deal with.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I jump in with a follow-up question about these European subsidies? Would you be able to actually use them in a different way nationally, or are they bound to go to the animal industry?
Well, to put it very simply, the agriculture subsidies that we have in Europe, they are based in there are two different subsidies. Half of the subsidies, they come directly from Brussels and go directly to the farmers or to the producer. But the other half, that is used by the member state, so in this case Sweden, and there we have a lot of freedom of maneuver. So with those money we can decide, no, we would like to allocate more money to plant-based production, for instance, and less to animals. We don't do that, however, which is very unfortunate, but yes, so there is a certain scope of maneuver here.
David, regarding the health, we saw a little bit on the film, and I know you're an expert in this. Would you say there are any benefits with dairy consumption, and also the opposite? Are there any disadvantages with the dairy consumption? And of course, animal products in general, but if we focus on dairy here?
I would not say that there are benefits to anyone here. Maybe in a very poor country where people are starving, milk could be a nutritious food item that would decrease malnutrition and be beneficial for everyone, but not here. If you look at milk, it contains actually nothing that's beneficial. What benefits our health is fiber and antioxidants, and these are found in whole plant foods. They are basically absent in milk. Instead, you have hormones, you have saturated fat, things that harm our health. So it's a terrible food item. But the problem with milk is that there are worse food items like red meat and processed meat and sugar. And the reason why milk isn't discouraged by national health organizations is that when you look at population studies, milk doesn't come out as bad because it all depends on what you compare with. And in Sweden, for instance, 15% of our calorie intake are whole plant foods, which means that the rest is sugar, meat, and French fries, and God knows what. And if you look at this population and you ask yourself what happens to those who eat more milk and those who eat less milk, many studies doesn't come up with show that milk is particularly harmful. And these kind of studies are used by the dairy industry to paint a picture that this is actually a good food item, but it isn't, of course.
Before we end, I want to ask you a question. Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. Should I do that?
Yeah, please.
Okay. We have a very influential physician in Sweden called Agnes Wold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's getting interviewed in pods and she says that I think if everybody could eat just what they want, everybody would be very healthy. What do you think of that statement?
Yes, I'm of a different opinion. And, I've received a lot of emails, and a professor in nutrition I know has written to the Swedish radio and complained and created a thread of basically all the nutritional researchers in Sweden, and they have all cried when they heard these statements. It's very, very sad. Agnes Wold is not a nutritional scientist, she's a bacteriologist. And basically she's a layman in this field,
Yes,
and
yeah.
shouldn't
But I know people listen to her.
yes,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, it's very sad. Camilla, what similarities did you see in the film? I mean, if you compare the dairy industry with New Zealand and Sweden, what similarities do you see, and also what differences? Also when it comes to an ethical perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. The only big difference is the numbers. In Sweden we have 300,000 cows to compare to 6 million, so that's of course a difference. But the idea and practice in the industry is the same, like the separation of cow and calf, for example, it's the same, and like everything else about the practice, because it's a cow, and you can't like they said in the movie as well, you can't make it more efficient, because it's always be a cow. Even if you breed it harder, we have done in Sweden as well as in New Zealand, to make them produce more milk, it still will be a living being that you need to take care of. It will never be a good way to create food. It will only create animal welfare problems, and like Jens was talking about with the industrialization of the milk industry, it's really bad. And right now in Sweden we have also the lobbying for the industry that wants to how do you say, the do you say grazing rights? Yeah, like the
Grass-fed.
yeah, they want to take more, have more cows inside. Right now they have like a legal obligation to at least some cows can come out during summer months, and now the industry wants to cut that. They call it more flexible legislation. So we need to like not only improve the animal welfare but also defend the animal welfare we have right now. So it's a lot of similarities, but
David, you have actually compared the strategy that the meat and dairy industry have with the tobacco industry. Would you like
Yes.
to just explain that similarity?
Yes. Basically, what they do is they hire researchers to present the data and change data and to create doubt. For instance, the dairy industry, I think, actually is the worst in this aspect. All of the food industry who are producing unhealthy food items, like the sugar industry, the salt industry, the meat industry, they are all doing this. But I would say the dairy industry is the worst and the most aggressive, and also the most successful. I mean, almost everyone in Sweden thinks that dairy is a healthy food items, that they're going to be sick if they don't drink it every day, and that's an idea that's very far from what the science shows. And this is one strategy, and also the way they are communicating against politicians and lobbying, and it's basically the same as the tobacco industry did in the 50s and the 60s, trying to actively work against public health measures like food taxation and restriction of commercials directed to children, for instance. So it's very, very sad, but I'm hoping for change any day soon.
I will hope that. Chris, this film that the MILKED, the film, it's very, very inspiring, and I love that you also bring up positive examples and things for the future that we actually can have in vision. And you're also talking a lot about transition in the film. What impact do you think a major transition in New Zealand will have on the environment?
If I could just go back and just talk about also the tobacco industry and how animal agriculture has learned from tobacco. One example of how they twist their studies, the dairy industry here promotes itself as being the most emissions efficient producer of dairy products, but it's just come to my attention that they've recently had to revise the study that they used for that calculation. And they've said that if they use the same international criteria to measure their emissions, because they've actually used a different system, this is how scientists, change the methodology of a study to get the result that they want. If they use the same international standards that other countries used, our emissions efficiency would be normalized. It would sit in the middle and wouldn't be exceptional at all. So often the propaganda that we hear from the industry is that they're sustainable, environmentally efficient and whatnot, but more or less we're the same as any other country. So if you ever hear anyone talking about the sustainability aspect of our dairy industry over here, it's just a complete greenwash. But in terms of transitioning, I feel like this is the topic, the issue of the night, is that moving away from animal agriculture is almost going to require a revolution. We need to highlight the negative ideologies wrapped up in it, the foundations of the industry, and it's incredibly inconvenient is probably the key thing for governments, for capitalists, and also for individuals facing cognitive dissonance and all sorts, generations of myths. But also, here in Aotearoa, we are the last stop before you get to the North Pole. Okay? So, in terms of being a food producing nation, within a global climate of where we're trying to encourage localized food consumption and production, it really makes very little sense for our country to be continuing as a food producer for the rest of the world. So the moving away from the idea of transitioning directly into other products is probably the best thing for us here. Instead of a transition program, we probably more need a shutdown program. Or instead of a transition from producing one product to another product, we should probably be looking into switching careers completely for our farmers, which of course is incredibly inconvenient because their identity is tied into producing food for other people. That's their lifestyle of producing food for people. And here in Aotearoa, we have incredible soil, climate, rain. We are incredibly set up to produce food. But because our current system is tied up in producing one thing specifically, dairy, it will be incredibly inconvenient and difficult to do so. But if we can do it here in Aotearoa, a country that is built off the backs of animals and so incredibly tied into animal agriculture, if we can do it, it will be a great example for the rest of the world. And because this is a very small country and things can travel quicker than other countries, there's a little bit less bureaucracy and corruption. Hopefully, we can find pathways to transition our farmers into something else and to shift our economy into something else to be an example to the rest of the world.
Sweden and EU are increasing the subsidies to the dairy industry at the moment. And we see that the dairy farms are tending to get bigger to be able to survive. On the same time, we see in the US, for instance, a transition movement growing, like very good initiatives with ranger advocacy program and so on that actually are building bridges between the plant-based industry and transition farmers who go into vegan farming. Do you think it could be possible to see something similar in EU and Sweden?
Yeah, I would really love to see that. And as we all know, we are in the midst of a crisis. First we had the COVID-19 and now we have this terrible war in Ukraine, and which increases prices on energy and gasoline and etc. And that, yes, that affects farmers. And it affects farmers that use a lot of fossil fuels even more. So then we should ask ourselves, okay, should we just pour more money over those farmers, or should we say to them that there is something, you have a problem in your production mode there, very much fossil energy, try to shift another production model, and then plant-based kind of a farming method would be the best solution. So we are not doing it right now, but if we could use this crisis as an opportunity to shift to a more environmentally friendly farming method, and that would, at the end of the day, be more or less plant-based. That would be fantastic.
Yes, very much. Annika, what crops would be good to grow in our climate? So.
Well, we can grow a lot of crops in our climate, and I mean, with climate change, we can grow even more diversity of crops. There's been discussion about growing corn, for example, large scale, but not for animal feed then. But we can grow, we have a lot of old types of legumes rich in protein that fixes nitrogen, for example, that we could develop. But as I know, we don't have any scientific efforts to develop strands of grain and legumes that are suitable for the Swedish climate. So that research would need to be enhanced because we don't have that. We have outsourced it to some other countries and so on. So that's something that needs to be part of the transition.
Yes.
To investigate what can we grow in Sweden, and we have a lot of opportunities to grow things in Sweden actually. And if we don't grow feed for cattle, grain or grass, we have a lot of land that is left. We can leave it to rewild, for example, or we can grow something else.
Yeah. David.
Yes, a follow-up question, because it's not quite often you hear from both the farming industry and also sometimes professors at the SLU are writing debate opinion pieces in newspapers saying that it's impossible. You have to grow this food for the animals because on this land it's impossible to grow food for people. What is your comment?
I think the argument I heard is that you need to grow grass in the, you have a circle of, you alternate your crops maybe during a 4 or 7 year period, and you need to grow grass in some places because it's good for the soil and so on. But it's not true, we can grow a lot of things. They think about maybe wheat, and maybe we can't grow wheat, but we can grow oat or any other things that we can eat, so yeah.
Very interesting. Camilla, this I think is the last question for the panel from us, and then we will let the audience in. Camilla, what, from Djurens Rätt perspective, what are proposals when it comes to dairy farming, like short and long term? I know, for instance, that Mercy for Animals in the US are doing these transition programs called transformation that inspire and help farmers to transit. Is that something you would like to do with Djurens Rätt in the future as well, or how do you think about, also doing this kind of work?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that needs to be done. Like one thing that we are working with right now is like we need a Minister of Animal Welfare in Sweden, because right now the minister with the responsibilities for animal welfare also has the industry's interest in her bag. So that needs to change, and maybe it would be the climate minister who could also have the animal welfare or something like that, because right now the animal welfare questions always is at the bottom of the agenda. So that's something that I think is very, with the election in this fall, we need to work harder to get animal welfare up in the agenda. In the short term, it's like I said before, the grazing rights for cows to keep the welfare that we have, and also advance the animal welfare standards. But in the future, absolutely, we could also work like Mercy for Animals with those kinds. But I would rather see that coming from the government with redirecting subsidies to plant-based innovation, because there's a lot of innovative projects going on, but they have no funds and no support from the government. So I would rather see it not from a non-profit, but from a government level to make a support for plant-based innovation. So it could be in large scale, because even if we are a big organization, we are a small impact compared to the government.
Exactly. Yes, please.
Just two important points I forgot to mention. The first is you asked me if there are benefits, and I think it's worth mentioning, which was mentioned in the film, that most people think that you need milk for strong bones. And when I was a little boy in the 80s, there were big posters at my school saying this: milk gives you strong bones. And if you look at a commercial today, it doesn't say that anymore. It says milk is an important source of calcium. And the important they've changed the message is that it's not true, that milk does not give you strong bones. It's shown after study, meta-analysis after meta-analysis, that people who drink more milk, they do not have less fractures, period. So that's very important. And the second thing, I said that the epidemiology, the population studies were a bit haltering when it came to disease risk and milk. But there's one exception, and that's cardiovascular disease. And it has to do with the saturated fats in milk, which raises our cholesterol, and this creates cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis in our whole body. This is there's a very strong evidence behind this. So milk definitely creates disease and death, premature death. And the Swedish health authority doesn't advise us to drink more milk. They say change the fat milk into low-fat milk. but and it's a reasonable advice. But it's also worth mentioning that the science doesn't really show a benefit of this transition. What it does show is that you should change saturated fat into unsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat. That's where the benefit lies, and that's what you achieve when you change from animal foods to plant foods.
Very good point.
Could I also
Yeah.
just ask you to give your best advice? We're an NGO and we're trying to help the politicians or convince them to actually do something about these problems. What are your best tips, if you can say shortly? What should we do? What do you think is most effective? Chris, can you start?
Well, what we've tried to do with the film is to tie in lots of different areas, to reach out to different demographics who are interested in different aspects that the dairy industry is negatively impacting on. So here in Aotearoa, very easy to have a diversity of different people, different experts, and different conversations to have around dairy production, whether it's health, whether it's the environment, whether it's animal rights, or here in Aotearoa, especially indigenous rights. So what I try to do for people is to tie in different narratives, to connect the dots for people, to show them that a response to this industry would be a real holistic response and beneficial to our society in a number of ways. And so, you know, if one angle doesn't work, you can talk about the next one, you can talk about the next one, and take it from there. Yeah, I would just say to try and connect the dots for everyone as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have some pro tips? Jens, perhaps?
Well, just to add on that, I think that's a very good advice. If we can add as many perspectives as possible, the animals, environment, public health, that makes the argument stronger. And strong arguments are good arguments to politicians. So if you top on that the subsidies, if you scrap the subsidies, you get more money. You can use the money for anything else. Then you have a very strong argument, I think.
Yeah. Is there any? Or we may have to let the audience ask some questions.
Yes, I think we have to. If there's any questions from the audience, please raise your hand. We don't have so much more time, but please, if there is any urgent questions, feel free.
Is there any difference between saturated fat in plants and saturated fat in animal products?
Yes, well, there is, but there are quite a few food items quite a few food items, plant food items that contain saturated fat. It's basically coconuts, especially coconut oil, which has been very popular in the recent years. As far as raising cholesterol, there's not much difference. So the recommendations from big cardiology organizations like the American Heart Association is to reduce even what they call tropical oils, like palm tree oil and coconut oil, for optimal heart health.
One more question.
If I could just add on to that point around the difference between saturated fat, whether it's from animal or plant-based, I would just say that if you are consuming a plant-based source, and I still probably wouldn't recommend it, the issues are the same, but if you are consuming a plant-based source, if you're getting it in its whole food form, then it will come along with the fiber and the phytonutrients that you find in plant-based foods. Of course, if it's the extracted oil, then you wouldn't be getting those whole food benefits, and I would encourage people to avoid it.
I was wondering about what the film said about precision fermentation. That seems to be a very promising new technology. Could revolutionize in 10 years, it was said in the movie, and I read a little bit about it. Do you have some knowledge about this? I mean, if this would succeed, it would be a totally game changer. Anyone?
Yes, who wants to? Chris or someone else in the panel would like to answer?
Oh, well, hopefully there's some people here who have some knowledge on precision fermentation. I'm not an expert on it. We interviewed experts of it, and I wish we could have them here, but it is a very exciting prospect. And like we know with other forms of technology, the car, the iPhone, etc., technology moves very, very quickly. And so I have my fingers crossed around precision fermentation. We have people here in Aotearoa working on the technology, and of course abroad. But there are a lot of aspects of precision fermentation that still need to be figured out. So I would just advise people to look at it with hope, but as well to continue on with every other avenue and aspect that we have to continue critiquing the industry, because I wouldn't like to say it's a gamble, but it's something that we haven't got concrete evidence on just yet, but fingers crossed.
Yes, we wanted to.
The process seems to be fairly similar to the cultivation of foods, cultivated meat, etc. Anyhow, in Europe, if you are to put a new food type on the market, you need to get approval from the novel food legislation. So at least, because I studied the cultivation of meat a bit, and so when it comes to cultivated meat, I know that I think they have filed so far 2 different types of cultivated meat to the European Union, and that process will take about 2 years until it's up and running in the market, if it gets an approval, which is not for certain, because all member states need to approve it, and there are some member states are more conservative than others, but I also think it's very promising.
Can I say?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, of course it's promising and so on, but we already have alternatives. We have technology. We have alternatives on the market, in the supermarkets, and the transition is we need to cut emissions within 2-3 years, and they should be halved in 8 years. So I mean, we shouldn't look too much to future technologies. Just take what we have, and we know it's better environmentally, and it's on the shelves and so on. So in the restaurants. So
the plant-based food.
Plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. Yeah.
That's the best, but if the consumer doesn't want to eat it, then and because 90% are still meat eaters, and if they can eat cultivated meats, maybe I'm not putting one thing against another. I think we should do both of it, but perhaps this could be a solution to have these conservative men to stop eat meat from animals, but still.
So the conservative men can eat beef for some time until we have something.
Yeah, until we come up with something better. Yeah.
Camilla, you also wanted to.
I was interviewed in a consumer study about the plant-based cheese alternative. I don't know if it was exactly the fermented one, but the study in Sweden showed that a lot of people would like to eat that kind of products. So the public opinion was optimistic. So that's at least something to be cheerful about. And I agree with you, Jens, that we should do a lot of things at one time. But it's hopeful that people wants to change if it's not that big of a change.
Yes, now it's 9 o'clock here in Sweden, and we've unfortunately run out of time. But I would like to thank Anne for the very good moderation of this discussion. I would also like to thank the panel and the audience, of course. You made the discussion also very interesting. And most of all, I would like to thank Chris, who is up early in the morning from New Zealand, and who has created this very